Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings and what I call responding to the critics. You know, I have this Friday, sometimes Saturday, which is sort of kind of what this is, segment in which I respond to the attacks of covenant eschatology, full preterism, fulfilled eschatology, et cetera, et cetera. And if you'll remember, I produced a 2021 video series responding and refuting the book by Kyle Pope, who is a Church of Christ minister, entitled Thinking About AD 70. Well, just recently, Brother Pope informed me that he had now produced a video. It appears that the video is over 2 hours long, supposedly answering what I had to say in my videos, instead of, breaking up his response into different segments that would be more easily viewed. 2 hours long. And as I filmed this morning, I have not watched the entire 2 hours. However, what I have done is I have watched his initial comments all the way through about 10 minutes. And you say, well, boy, Preston, you haven't touched the hem of the garment. But let me say this. What Brother Kyle Pope says and claims and teaches in the first 10 minutes of his video is, and I want to be as kind as possible, as I've said at other times, Brother Pope seems to be a likable type of guy. He's cordial in his comments, and I'm certainly not going to be anything else, but I will be frank. His comments in the very first 10 minutes of his video are some of the most convoluted, confused, and confusing comments, theological comments that a person will ever find. I could produce another 21 videos responding to the error found in the first 10 minutes of Kyle Pope's video. That's not a brag, it's just simply a fact. Now, here's what you absolutely must understand. Kyle Pope very often appeals in his book, Thinking About AD 70. He has entire chapters or entire segments in his book quoting from and applying the Old Testament prophecies of the last days, coming of the Lord, judgment, kingdom, etc., to the so-called yet future end of time. Now, as I pointed out in my video response, this is the most fundamental error in Brother Pope's theology and eschatology. Now, make no mistake, he's got plenty of errors, logical fallacies, and just blatant contradictions that could be addressed. But the bottom line is this. If I can prove that Kyle Pope's view and theology in regard to the law of Moses is false, if I can prove that his view of, quote, Israel, unquote, is false, then every single thing in his 2 hour plus video is false. I know that sounds like a generalization, but I will vindicate that claim even in this video. Now, in the very first few moments, in fact, at about the 4 minute, 35, 40 minute second mark, Brother Pope says in virtually all 21 of his videos, Preston claimed that I teach God was through with Israel at the cross. Preston claims that I teach that there was no applicability of the law after the cross. And he says, I never used that terminology. I was literally stunned as I listened and viewed his comments. I've gone back. I have viewed it. I have listened to it repeatedly to make sure that I was reading and hearing, or not reading, but viewing and hearing what I thought I was hearing, and I was. Brother Pope gives us an example from Genesis chapter 49:10 and following. A lawgiver shall not depart from Judah or the scepter until Shiloh comes, and to him shall the gathering of the people be. And Brother Pope goes, well, does Brother Preston believe this is still applicable? Because after all, Brother Pope argued, people are still being gathered to Christ. Therefore, Genesis 49, which, as he points out, is Torah, the fundamental aspect of the law of Moses, does Preston not believe that's still going on? If he does, then he's refuted himself. And my response to that is, no, not hardly. Not even close. Because you see, the gathering of the people there has to do with the final gathering of Old Covenant Israel and the end of Old Covenant Israel's age, the harvest at the end of Israel's age, so that the endless, eternal, unending kingdom of Christ. And by the way, it's fascinating that that Brother Pope actually admits the kingdom has no end. Well, that means that evangelism has no end. And yet he chided me for teaching that. So, Brother Pope has a fundamental misunderstanding of Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10. It is not about the eternal ingathering of anybody and everybody into the kingdom or to Christ. It is referring, because after all, Genesis 49, 1 and following, Jacob gathers the children around him and says, let me tell you what shall befall you. These are the descendants of Jacob. These are the 12 tribes of Jacob. I will tell you what shall befall you in the last days. Now, Brother Pope has a serious problem here. Why? Because, as I shall explicate further here momentarily, Brother Pope believes, please catch the power of what I am about to say. Now, Brother Pope tells us that his video of 2 hours plus is the final word, the last word he's going to have to say about this entire issue. So I really believe that Brother Pope owes it to his brethren and his branch of the churches of Christ. He owes it to anyone and everyone that views his video, regardless of their denominational affiliation. Brother Pope owes it to his audience to answer the question, is it his view that God was through with Old Covenant Israel after the flesh at the cross? Now again, at about the 449 mark, he calls attention to the fact that I said repeatedly that Brother Pope believes that God was through with Israel at the cross. And he says, I never used that terminology. Now, I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that Brother Pope is guilty of a shell game. I believe he's guilty of being disingenuous. Because unless he takes a different view from the traditional view in the churches of Christ, one of the most fundamental doctrines in the amillennial / Church of Christ view or fellowship is God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross. But he says, Preston says, constantly, all 21 videos that I teach, Kyle Pope, teach God was through with Israel at the cross. You see, he ever so conveniently left out the term Old Covenant Israel. And this is the crux of the matter, ladies and gentlemen. This is the crux of the matter. So, I believe that Brother Kyle Pope owes it to any and all viewers. Maybe he can post a comment in the written form of his presentation that will be put out. Brother Kyle Pope needs to answer the question. Does Kyle Pope teach that God was through with old covenant Israel after the flesh at the cross, yes or no? Does he believe that God was through with the old law at the cross? Well, let's let him answer that question. Back to the book, which I read from, ladies and gentlemen. I read these quotes for you in my review of his book. And now, however, he comes back and gives this rather disingenuous response to refute and answer what I had to say, hoping that his viewers will not catch the nuance that he conveniently throws into the mix. On page 49, he says, quote, Preston argued that Colossians is a Gentile book. Certainly, in this passage, Paul speaks of their past condition as characterized by the uncircumcision of your flesh, unquote. But it is also clear that there were some members within the church at Colossae who came from a Jewish background. By the way, I never denied that. Never. So I don't know why he's trying to make a point of that. Anyway, as seen from teachings regarding Sabbath, Colossians 2:16, and the worship of angels, Colossians 2:18. We should note that he speaks of Christ having taken out of the way and having nailed to the cross what he calls the handwriting of requirements that was against us. What was that? Some translations bring out a different sense here, rendering it the certificate of debt consisting of decrees, New American Standard. Or, quote, the record that stood against us with its legal demands, unquote, New Revised Standard Version. It is true that the Gentiles were never under Mosaic law, but all are under sin, Romans 3:9. Now watch. And sin is not imputed where there is no law, Romans 5:13. Now watch. Paul is telling the Colossians that the divine law which established them as sinners before God, which law was that? Torah, the law of Moses. Paul is telling the Colossians that the divine law which established them as sinners before God was nailed to the cross. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if the divine law that accused them of being sinners and convicted them of being sinners was Torah, which is Kyle Pope's position, if that law which accused them of being sinners was Torah, and if the law that accused them of being sinners was, per his own words, nailed to the cross, then point number one, the law of Moses was nailed to the cross. Sorry, no way out of it. Now, consider this. Kyle Pope tells us, I'll get to it in a moment, Kyle Pope tells us, and here it is right here, the law of Moses was nailed to the cross. Well, let me ask you a question, ladies and gentlemen. If and since Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10, even though it predated the law of Moses, clearly, and yet Kyle Pope applies it to our future, he is applying what he himself calls Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy. He is applying Torah to our future. And he says, okay, I got to find this note here. At the 8:59 mark, 50 and so on mark, he says, when one law supersedes another, this does not mean that the prior law no longer has any applicability Wait a minute. When one law supersedes another, this does not mean that the prior law no longer has any applicability. So if this law passes away, according to Brother Pope's position in the video, even though it has passed away, it still has applicability. Oh, whoa, wait, hang on. On page 57, Brother Kyle Pope wrote, now this is in the midst of an awful lot of things that he says, trying to establish that the law of Moses had been done away. That's his point in these pages. So, on the one hand, he tells us the law of Moses, the law which condemned sin, pointed out sin, defined sin, was nailed to the cross. Oh, but wait. The new law, the law that replaced it, has become the standard of sin. Well, I could say an awful lot about that, okay? But I want to get to this. Let's make a final significant things, or take notice of final significant things that the Hebrew writer taught. This, again, this is page 57. He speaks of the annulling of the former commandment because of the weakness and unprofitableness. Hebrews chapter 8:17. So, make no mistake, he is saying the former covenant, the law of Moses, he is applying Hebrews chapter 7 verse 18 and saying it has been annulled. Had been annulled when Hebrews was written. Okay. We have already discussed some ways in which Mosaic law was weak and unprofitable, but note in this passage that he speaks of the annulling of the former commandment. Remember, he's talking to Jewish Christians. The word translated annulling is athesis, meaning abolition, disannulling, put away, and rejection. So here is Kyle Pope saying that when Hebrews chapter 7 was written, the former commandment, i.e. the law of Moses, had been annulled, abolished, put away, no longer in force. And here is a direct quote from page 57, third paragraph down, quote, that which is abolished, annulled, or put away is no longer in force. He writes further, that is the Hebrew writer writes further, if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. He refers to the new covenant as a second. 2 chapters later, he declares of Christ, he takes away the first that he may establish the second. Hebrews 10:9. This suggests that in order to establish the second, the first, i.e. the Mosaic law, had to be taken away. Now, wait a minute. Folks, do you catch the power of this? Do you realize how Kyle Pope has completely obliterated his own argument? He tells us at the 8:59 mark, just because a law has been taken away doesn't mean it doesn't have any applicability. Doesn't mean it's no longer in force, because you see, he believes Genesis 49:10 is still in force. It is still applicable. Well, if Genesis 49:10 is still applicable, then it was not annulled. It wasn't abrogated. It wasn't removed. It wasn't nailed to the cross. And so here, Brother Kyle Pope, so let's back up and just put the two positions in really, really stark contrast. After I pointed out time after time after time, yeah, perhaps all 21 videos, that God was through with Israel, and by that I meant, more on this in a moment, by that I meant God was through with Old Covenant Israel at the cross, and listen, ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake. Now, if Kyle Pope wants to send me an email and correct me on this, that's just wonderful, and I will certainly comment on it, and I will apologize in a future video. But listen to me, ladies and gentlemen, being accused of such a gross, consistent, persistent misrepresentation, that's a pretty egregious charge, and I take that very seriously. It would never, ever, ever be my purpose or intent or desire to misrepresent anyone. That's why I said that when I listened the very first time, I'm going, whoa, wait a minute. He says he never said that God was through with Israel at the cross? And then I went back and listened more carefully. And what he means is, he does not believe that God was through with the new, redefined Israel, i.e. the church. But ladies and gentlemen, that's not the point. You know, he quoted Romans chapter 2, 28 and 29. A man who is a Jew, who is one inwardly. Circumcision is that which is of the heart, not of the flesh. Fine. No problem. Romans chapter 9, verse 6. They are not all Israel. No, who are called Israel. Fine. I agree. That is not the point, ladies and gentlemen. My point throughout the entirety of my 2021 videos was Kyle Pope's position. And again, I invite him to correct me on this if I am wrong. Kyle Pope's position is God was through with, number one, the law of Moses. Oh, but wait, he doesn't really believe God was through with the law of Moses at the cross, because he believes that Genesis 49:10 is still applicable, doesn't he? So on the one hand, he tells us God was through with the law of Moses at the cross, and then he applies the law of Moses to our future. So he contradicts himself, and he contradicts Scripture. He says the law of Moses was annulled, abrogated, taken out of the way at the cross. Then he applies the law of Moses to the future. All the while telling us that which is annulled, abolished, annulled, or put away is no longer in force. He believes Genesis 49 is still in force because, you see, he fails to understand that Genesis 49 had to do with Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel, in Israel's last days. It is not about the ongoing gathering to Christ under the new covenant. I mean, it specifically says it's about Israel, it's about the 12 tribes of Israel, and it's about Israel's last days. But you see, Kyle Pope defines the last days as the Christian age. Thus, he must, because Genesis 49 is not about the church, ladies and gentlemen, redefined as Israel. It is about the physical lineage of Jacob's children, the 12 tribes of Israel. And this is where Kyle Pope's view runs into even more problem. Now look, I will recognize, I agree 100%, God has redefined Israel. Oh yeah, the church is the new Israel of God, Galatians 6, 15 and 16. That is not the point I was making. You have to catch the power of that. I wasn't saying Kyle Pope believes that God was through with the new Israel at the cross. I never said that. I never hinted at that, because the new Israel was not established until after the cross. See, that would be kind of silly, wouldn't it? My point was and is this: all New Testament eschatology is nothing but the expectation of the imminent fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel after the flesh. Let me give you a really prime example of that. In Romans chapter 8, Paul was anticipating the redemption of the body. or more specifically and accurately, the redemption of our body, as he called it. Where did that hope of the redemption of the body come from, ladies and gentlemen? Well, it came from Isaiah 25. Was that the Old Testament? Yeah. It came from Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Was that the Old Testament? Yeah. It came from Isaiah 26. And 27. Are those Old Testament prophecies made to Old Covenant Israel? Let me very quickly make this point. Isaiah 25 and the promise of the resurrection, which Paul quotes from in 1 Corinthians 15, would be fulfilled when the city of Jerusalem and the temple were handed over to strangers. Does Kyle Pope place that in the future? Well, if he's going to stay with the context, he has to. Is he going to define the city and the temple as the church? He has to, if he's going to place the resurrection in the future, or else he's going to have to take the position that this Israel, that this city, and this temple was not actually talking about Old Covenant Israel, Old Covenant Jerusalem, Old Covenant temple. Does Kyle Pope believe that the coming future to Isaiah, salvation of Israel, when the Lord would come and take away their sin of Isaiah chapter 27, 9 and following, does Kyle Pope believe that is yet future? Matter of fact, he does. Because in Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27, when Paul says, "Brethren, I would not have you to be ignorant of this mystery, how that blindness in part has happened unto Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel shall be saved." Guess what? Kyle Pope applies that to the future. But you see, the coming of the Lord for the salvation of Israel in Romans chapter 11 would be the fulfillment of Isaiah 27, 10 and following, of Isaiah 59, 16 and following. Both of those prophecies would be fulfilled when God came in judgment of Israel for shedding innocent blood. So if Kyle Pope is going to say, well, you know, Romans chapter 11, that's the salvation of the new Israel, the spiritual Israel, then at some time in the future, God is going to come in judgment of the church, the new Israel, for shedding innocent blood. Do you think that will work? When Jesus said in Matthew chapter 23 that all of the blood of all the righteous would be avenged in the judgment of Jerusalem in his generation? But you see, ladies and gentlemen, the entirety of Kyle Pope's eschatology is a denial that all New Testament eschatology was the expectation of the imminent fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. So, I mentioned Romans 8 and 9. Paul anticipated the imminent, and yes, it was imminent, coming of the redemption of our body. Romans 8:23. And now notice what he continues to say. As he anticipated that coming salvation, Paul said, "I tell you the truth in Christ, I do not lie. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit, that I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren's sake, or for my brethren, my countrymen, according to the flesh." Paul, who are you hoping would achieve this redemption of the body, of our body? Notice how chapter 9 is not disconnected, not divorced from chapter 8. Furthermore, in Romans chapter 11, in Paul's anticipation of the salvation of all Israel, in his prediction of the salvation of all Israel, notice what Paul has to say as he continues. Oh, by the way, in regard to this Israel that he's talking about, well, because of unbelief, they who? Israel. Because of unbelief, they were broken off. You stand by faith. You who? the Gentiles who were claiming that God was through with Israel at the cross. Old covenant Israel. Surely no one would take the position that the Gentiles were saying that the new covenant Israel had been cut off at the cross. Right? Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell. Those who? Israel. But toward you goodness, and if you continue in his goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. They who? Israel. If they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, who are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Well, what tree is that? It's Old Covenant Israel, going all the way back to Abraham as the root. Now watch this. Concerning the gospel, they who? Israel. The old Israel that would be saved. Concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. Concerning the election, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul doesn't shift gears here. He's talking about the salvation of the righteous remnant of Old Covenant Israel after the flesh. They would be saved. Israel's Old Covenant relationship with Yahweh terminated, consummated, fulfilled at the coming of the Lord in the judgment of Old Covenant Israel for shedding innocent blood. So let me say, ladies and gentlemen, this in closing, this will be ultra brief. Once again, all New Testament eschatology was the anticipation of the imminent fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Paul said it was the 12 tribes, not the church, the 12 tribes of Israel that longed for the resurrection. That's not a denial that the church would anticipate that. It's just simply to realize that the promise was given initially to Israel. Paul said, Acts chapter 24, 13 and following, "This I confess to you, that according to the way which they, the Pharisees, call a sect, so worship I the God of my fathers, believing all things that are written in the law and the prophets." Now, that's Old Covenant. That's the Torah. Believing all things are written in the law and the prophets, that there is about to be resurrection of the just and unjust. Paul believed that the resurrection of the just and the unjust was found in Moses, the law, and the prophets. Those are not New Covenant law and prophets, except in this sense. Except in this sense. The New Covenant writers were anticipating, that's why they were quoting, alluding to, and citing from the Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel. They never said, and this is why Brother Pope's entire view of the old law being annulled at the cross is wrong. A proper understanding of what they were teaching about the passing of the law, it actually invalidates Brother Pope. But the reality is, anytime and every time Brother Kyle Pope quotes from an Old Testament prophecy to speak of a yet future coming of the Lord, judgment and resurrection, he invalidates his own position that says the law of Moses was abrogated, annulled, taken away at the cross. Because you see, ladies and gentlemen, and I've got to be absolutely brief here, Jesus said, "Not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law," and he meant by that the prophets as well, "until it is all fulfilled." Well, guess what Kyle Pope does? He has the sacrificial system, the cultus, taken away at the cross. Oh, he has the Sabbath removed at the cross. But then he goes to Isaiah 65 and says, oh, we're still looking for the new heavens, new earth. He goes to Ezekiel 40 to 47 and the Messianic temple, and he says, we're still looking for that. He goes to Isaiah 25, and he says, we're still looking for that resurrection. So whereas Jesus says, not one jot, not one tittle shall pass from the law until it's all fulfilled, Kyle Pope says, well, some of the law and the prophets have passed away. But a whole bunch of the law and the prophets remain valid, binding, and applicable. And let me call your attention again. He says in the video, attempting to answer me, just because a law has been annulled doesn't mean it's applicable. And yet in his own book, let me read it again, quote, that which is abolished, annulled, or put away is no longer in force, unquote. Brother Kyle Pope contradicts himself irretrievably, fatally, against what he said in his own book versus what he said in the video. And worst of all, he contradicts Scripture. Okay, now, I'll have more to say in response to his video. That may or may not be next week because I've got other videos to review that have recently been published. One of them entitled, Sam Frost posted a notice of it just the other day, entitled, and it's supposedly from, I think, his pastor, entitled, Refuting Don Preston. So I'm going to watch that. I'm going to see what the gentleman has to say and probably offer some initial comments about that, and then we'll move on. Okay? Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great weekend. God bless.